Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Perlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Perlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about the intersection of art, culture, human exceptionalism, nature, and the climate crisis with my guest, Claire Farago. She is Professor Emerita in the Department of Art History at the University of Colorado, Boulder, where she taught for 30 years. Recently, she was the Ruth and Clarence Kennedy Professor of Renaissance Studies at Smith College, Northampton, Massachusetts. She has also held visiting professorships at UCLA, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the University of Melbourne, Australia, York University in the United Kingdom, and the University of Zurich in Switzerland. She has received fellowships from the Getty Research Institute, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright Foundation, the Folger Library, and elsewhere. She has published widely on art theory and transcultural studies and the history of style, museums, and collecting practices, and is a specialist on the manuscripts of Leonardo da Vinci. She has written extensively and has many volumes of work, including Reframing the Renaissance, Grasping the World, the Idea of the Museum, and Art is Not What You Think It Is, as well as her most recent publication, Writing Borderless Histories of Art, Human Exceptionalism, and the Climate Crisis. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be on your program, and I am so grateful to have this opportunity to spread the ideas that I have been working on in my study for the past 6 years or so, based on a lifetime of thinking about these issues.
And those ideas I definitely want to explore with you. You're an expert in art history, and yet you see that we have a planet that is being destroyed by human activity. We are destroying nature. We are not relating to nature. You have seen how artists have used nature or not used nature in their art over centuries from many different cultures. What can we learn from art to help us solve our environmental crisis?
I think that the indigenous ways of connecting with the environment offer a nice paradigm, but it's of course not the only one. Bo Zhang, who is Chinese, about the 0.1% of the planet destroying the whole rest of it. So anyone can pitch into this. And I think it's important to focus on the emancipatory potential of our very difficult history so that we can come together for a brighter future. My work is an aspirational, historical, and critical book that offers a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between human and the rest of nature.
Your book is a fascinating, well-documented account of art history and nature and people. You cover so many different areas of Eurocentric versus indigenous art, who is human, how art is represented in theology, why we should or should not keep items in museums, capitalism and how it affects us in terms of art and nature and the climate crisis, a wide variety of topics. I was fascinated by how you brought all of these different fields together. So let's begin rather generically why you are concerned about art history, and how it relates to our climate crisis.
Great. I just give you some ideas of where this project originated and how it unfolded quite differently from what I initially thought it would. I can do that.
Whenever one does a study, you start with a certain hypothesis and theme, and then it develops as you discover new information.
Absolutely. And my idea was that I needed to better understand and maybe contribute to others something about discipline of art history, where it came from, and how the subject of art is entangled with the subject of humanness with respect to our current situation of the climate and environmental crises and degradation of the planet. And the whole idea of looking into what is a colonial and colonialist history is to rethink that history for its emancipatory potential so that we can come up with something more sustainable. Everyone knows that humans need to change the relationship of humans to the rest of nature. In my project and my thinking, the word planetary seems to be the most likely way to give value to other forms of life besides humans, because we are, not many people would disagree with this, although some would, but humans are just beating out every other life form on the planet at the expense of our own environment and our own sustainability. So I developed this project. As you mentioned, I'm an expert or written a lot about Leonardo da Vinci's writings. His writings on painting, his writings on comparing painting to other art forms formed the basis of a very important tradition of comparative analysis. And that was really my initial dissertation project and very first book. And I started thinking, well, what's left out of that archive? So I'm looking at archival forms of knowledge. I'm looking at primary text. And eventually, fast forwarding another 30 years or so, I'm thinking about what is left out of the archive in even much broader ways to capture the diversity of voices and to write a more open, porous text, more experimental than I do for my narrow academic audiences, so that I can bring the knowledge that I have accrued to this conversation about environmental degradation and where does the planet head from here and how can we work together for a sustainable future. And I'm just one of very many voices, and as we were already saying before the recording part started, there's so much to read that if one tries to master this, then the game is over, because it's not a matter of mastery as much as it is contributing one's voice and knowledge to a conversation, dialogue.
The first few chapters in your book focus on how we define art and who creates art and who doesn't. I was surprised to read where Leonardo da Vinci, who we all know as a very creative person, artist, but also scientist, that some of his work was deleted from publication because it didn't reflect the current thinking of the time in terms of what is art, what is nature, who is human.
Yes, so let me give you a little bit more detail about that. So my work for many years dealt with a book on painting that Leonardo conceived that was carried on after his death by his student, who was his scribe as well, and a humanist, so an unusual art student that he probably hired around 1508 to help him consolidate his notes into something that he always called a book on painting. And after his death in 1519, Francesco Melzi carried on this project, and after he died in 1567, there's a little gap there. We don't know what happened to the manuscript codex that he was compiling, and it kind of got lost in the record. So by the time it resurfaced at the end of the 18th century, this original text, a shorter version had been published, and that shorter version came into being around 1570 at the height of the Catholic Reformation and its response to the Protestant Reformation, which was attacking artifice and all kinds of wasteful things that were taking away from humans' ability to know God and so on. So the Catholic Reform movement was very broad and complex, and I go into it in some detail in my book. It was very much aligned with Leonardo's idea of naturalistic painting that was scientifically geared to be related to what we see directly with our eyes. So his writings are very much involved with optics, with what we call pictorial perspective, and how to translate what you see, nature's ephemera, onto the painted surface. And that's what he wrote about. He wrote a book that was intended for students. And that was all well and good, but when somebody who was very close to the Catholic Reformation art writers, who were bishops and so on, got a hold of it, they decided that the part where Leonardo says that the artist is free to use his imagination and investigate nature and come up with his own ideas, that was a little bit risky. So they started to take it down and also to simplify the structure. And in the end, they left 40% of the original text. And then that text was circulating widely before it was ever published in the mid-17th century. It became the framework for academic artistic instruction for centuries. So it's a great text to be looking at the legacy of Leonardo's ideas, his historical legacy before the rediscovery of this unique full manuscript and before his unpublished notes started to be published at the end of the 19th century. So we often think we have access to that Leonardo, but historically no one had access to that Leonardo for hundreds of years. So my book talks about what people did have access to and how did that affect the idea that art is the imitation of natural appearances, and how is that institutionally structured structured, and so on.
How does understanding art history help us solve our climate crisis?
Well, we usually think about the climate crisis developing with the Industrial Revolution, but it really goes far back to the initial period of European expansionism and colonization in the 16th century and ever after. So thought structures are also very important, and this book is about those thought structures.
Throughout your book, you explore the idea of what is art and who considers art, whether or not different human populations could create art, and if the art is natural, presents the natural environment. Going to one of your later chapters, I saw a picture of an artist who, in the grass, had pointed out that humans are only 0.01% of life here on the planet, and yet our life as humans has really destroyed our environment, created the climate crisis. You bring those concepts together. What are you trying to get across to your reader?
I don't have like one message. I'm really talking about the entanglement of a lot of different issues. But art is, as a book that you mentioned, I co-published with my husband and co-author, Donald Preziosi, Art is Not What You Think It Is. Today, anything can be art, and anybody that spends their time trying to define it for other people is probably not going to be able to satisfy everybody, or is that even something we want to do? But historically, art has been an index of humanness because other people were judged on the basis of the kind of things that they made. So historically speaking, art has a deep history of texts and practices, and that's what I was looking at. So I came along in this project after there had been a lot of work, including my own, on the formation of art history as a discipline in the 19th century, a rather Eurocentric project that defined what art was and then tried to expand that to the rest of the world. But unfortunately, that concept had already been informed by the hundreds of years that I'm looking at in this book of thinking of a progress of civilization from so-called savage people to so-called civilized people, and those people are always in Europe, and they're the ones that are practitioners of the kind of art that we associate even today with Leonardo da Vinci. So you can't get into somebody else's brain, right? So the question is, how are you going to judge whether somebody is human or not? That was a question that explorers and kings and popes wanted to answer when they started expanding and colonizing in the Americas and elsewhere in the world. So they turned to this deep Aristotelian tradition that says that humans are exceptional because of their ability to make art and to think discursively. Animals, according to this Aristotelian tradition that is now pretty much overturned, but it's still there in the popular imagination, is that animals, whatever they do, even when they make art, like birds' nests or spider webs are the two traditional forms of animal art making that are discussed, they do it by instinct. They don't do it by thinking. So now we know that that's not really the case, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about all of that. But I was looking at the history of this idea that you can judge people by the kind of art they make, and that there is a lot at stake for figuring out whether somebody is fully human or only looks human, and if they are not fully human, can they be used as animals to extract material resources and make things that belong to the Americas feed the commodity market in Europe and around the world. So that's a kind of entanglement that I wanted to look at historically. Nowadays we think art can be anything, but that was definitely not the case throughout this history. Europeans inherited this rich cultural, philosophical tradition. I'm not against that at all either. I wouldn't be working on Leonardo. But when they started to impose those ideas on other peoples, they didn't think that those other people's ideas really mattered.
We know that terminology has changed too. As an anthropologist myself, we used to talk about primitive art, but we know it's not primitive just because non-Europeans created it. And art has basically been presented in every culture, in every group of people, but in many different ways using local materials and local designs, and reflects the environment in which they live. And we are going to talk more about this important concept of art, nature, the environment, our current crises in protecting our environment when we return in a moment with my guest, Claire Farago, who is author of Writing Borderless Histories of Art, Human Exceptionalism, and the Climate Crisis.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310 559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Claire Farago, who is Professor Emerita of Art History at the University of Colorado Boulder. We are talking about her recent book, Writing Borderless Histories of Art, Human Exceptionalism and the Climate Crisis. You had a number of chapters dealing with the concept of art of indigenous people and also the current controversy going on over the repatriation of museum cultural artifacts and whether or not museums should have on display indigenous cultures material items or return them to the various groups, tribes, nations around the world. What is the dilemma and how is it being solved?
Well, that's a short question that would probably take an encyclopedia to respond to, but let me give a quick try. So how did all these artifacts end up in our museums? So that would be a good place to start. Well, it started with collecting practices that go back way before the 16th century, actually. Collecting practices evolved over time, and in the 19th century, it became an important activity for modern nation-states to provide their citizens with a universal history that was partially based on material objects. With that came the idea that you should plunder everybody else's cultural heritage and send it back to Europe, and there was a huge competition among anthropologists, archaeologists, and art historians, and those fields of study were just in the process of formation. And so it turns out, and you know this from being an anthropologist yourself, that artifacts ended up in ethnology museums or anthropological museums, and the fine arts ended up in art galleries. So the fine arts were associated with civilization, and then there was this relatively new category, although as my book says, it goes way back to ancient Mediterranean ideas, that there was something called primitive art. And initially, the idea of the primitive art was meant to be a positive thing. It was better than cultures or societies not having art at all, which might have been the earlier version of that. There was enormous interest in studying this material culture to understand how humans evolved. So the premise was totally false, that there were primitive people and they evolved into civilized people. That's that arc of linear cultural progression that evolved along with scientific race theory and Darwin, who we think of as the father of a different way of thinking, but he still believed the earlier Christian idea that everybody had their own place in nature, and he situated what he called savages between modern humans and the rest of the animal world as a way of explaining his theory of evolution, that everybody is connected. In my book, there isn't a right and wrong and good and bad. I'm a historian. I want to understand how these ideas evolved and what part of those ideas do we still want to keep and how. You brought up the very difficult question of what do we do with all that stuff that is mostly in European and American and other once colonial museums, and how do we deal with it? So there isn't one answer at all. I tried to develop this discussion around a very, very famous example of the Benin bronzes, as they're called. In 1896, British soldiers invaded a palace in Benin, which is now in Nigeria, and they killed a lot of people, and they kept their stuff, and this is not a unique instance, but in this instance, the European museums that ended up having this material, because they took the material and then they sold it all over the place, were really impressed by how fine the quality of the artwork was. So it was meant to be something positive, but those values have changed greatly, and now we're in a position where many groups are asking for their materials that were illegally plundered to be given back. But how do you do that? And how do you do that when those people who own that stuff aren't really around? Or how do you decide who gets to keep it? So this whole business of repatriation has developed a legal structure of deciding how things should be done. There's an act called the NAGPRA Act, of Native American Rights Act, of returning things. And many people, anthropologists and art historians too, are working with other institutional officials and with the groups themselves to figure out what to do in a case-by-case basis.
This is an excellent example of the complexities of what to do with the history of human cultures and even of natural wildlife. You mentioned Benin. I was surprised to hear that the African Americans, the Black Americans here in the United States, actually don't want to send back that material because Benin was participating at the time in the slave trade, and they feel that those items should stay here. And so you have, again, many different people with many different ideas of what should happen, what shouldn't happen, what has happened. I enjoyed your reference to the Australian Aborigines who viewed the plant, animal life, and even the non-sentient life, the rocks and the environment, as connected to them, and how there was a spirit that came from them, and how important it was for them to travel throughout their desert region to connect to the environment. Do you think that we need to instill that idea among the billions of people on the planet?
Very short answer is yes. We need to decenter ourselves and think about how we are part of the planet in responsible ways.
Your book has pages and pages of documentation of where you got your sources, what your information was. What surprised you the most when you did this research?
That's a great question. I'm so happy that you asked it, because I was about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the book when I discovered that what I had been calling cultural geographies, well known since the 16th century, these are illustrated or not illustrated, some both, ethnographies of other people that put other people's cultures into slots based on ancient European ideas of what a society is, their religion, their forms of education, their art-making practices, and so on. And if things don't fit into those categories, of course, they're lost from view. That was well known, and I had written about that before, and so had others, especially anthropologists. And then I was working on these texts and discovered that they were known as climate histories, and they are exactly climate histories because they suggest that your capabilities depend on where you were born, what the climate is. And as I say, these are ancient Mediterranean ideas, and so it's not surprising that the Mediterranean is thought to be the ideal place to live with the ideal climate. And if it's too cold, then your mind doesn't work one way or as well, and if it's too hot, and if it's too dry, and so on. So that's what I mean by historical theories of climate. That term came up in the 19th century, but it's widely used, and it was a very important way of deciding how human people were. When we think of writers, philosophers like Hegel or Kant, they weren't just thinking about art in the spiritual sense. They were also denigrating and discounting people based on this long history of thinking about the mentality of people depending on where they were born. So when I found that out, I knew that that had to be really central to my whole book, because it's a way of seeing ourselves in the mirror of history, maybe in a way that we don't want to see ourselves, but we need to work out from that history because those ideas are still haunting us today. Unless we unpack them, they will continue to influence us without our even knowing it.
In your extensive research, what stood out the most to you?
What stood out for me the most was the ability of humans to change society through the way that they see art. The ability of art to change society, I think, is the overriding message of my book, but not without looking at the history critically.
Let's get to one of your other examples in the latter part of your book of the Hawaiian Islands and how the native Hawaiians lost some of their water rights, and we remember the fires on Maui destroying a very historic town. That, again, shows how capitalism, people respond to the environment in different ways. You sort of bring this concept up throughout the book about how people deal and present their relationship to nature.
Exactly. I was finishing this book when the fires in Maui broke out. I thought, well, this would be a very good place to start the way that we can work with nature towards sustainability by recognizing the deep knowledge and ecological practices of indigenous peoples. So the fires in Maui broke out because The water that had been used to keep everything in balance had been bought up and used by the tourist industry. So it's like a colonialist practice. So a colonialist refers to colonial practices that continue after the end of colonialism. So they keep reproducing the same power structure and the same lack of sensitivity. If the water had remained in the hands of the indigenous population and the permanent settlers in Hawaii and the Hawaiian Islands and Maui in this case, then maybe there wouldn't have been the drought. It looks verdant and green, but actually Maui was suffering from droughts, and nobody really realized what that was. I rely on many, many people because nobody can be an expert on all of this, and one really formative influence for me has been the work of Naomi Klein, who is a journalist. One of her earlier books was Shock Doctrine, which talks about the way the capitalists rush in the face of trauma and then capitalize on the trauma and make money on rebuilding. I was looking at the relationship of indigenous knowledge to sustainability practices and thinking about art-making practices in this very broad sense, that anything that humans make is art, is made by human skill. That's the most fundamental and simple way that art has been defined historically that's still relevant today.
Please explain why you call your chapters fugues and you have intermezzos. Chapter names are fascinating. Defining an ecological approach on the history of human exceptionalism, borderless thinking on our animal planet, on the future of the past. You are really bringing together so many different scholastic, academic studies and tying them together from art to economics to environmentalism to biology, anthropology.
I drew on a wide variety of fields, Nancy, because the way that modern knowledge has become so specialized has fragmented our ability to see the historical issues more broadly. I wanted to be able to address a broad audience with this particular book, and I wanted to understand it too. So my choice of the word fugue was twofold because of the meaning of fugue itself. So a fugue is a European musical form in which the same theme gets repeated until it kind of comes full circle around. And that's sort of the way that my book is structured. But there is also a through narrative that connects the issues through time. And that's why I had to go much broader than a single discipline, because the discourse on art is much older and broader than modern art history or anthropology or any of it. In fact, an important aspect that most art historians aren't even aware of is the discourse on art that runs through political theory, political thought, based on the same Aristotelian texts about human exceptionalism. The other meaning of fugue, equally important, is a psychiatric state of not knowing where you're coming from, and it's often associated with being displaced. And I wanted in that to reference all the immigration that goes on because of climate change and war and violence. People are forced to become cosmopolitan in the worst sense of the word, is that they lose their homelands. They don't want to leave, but they have no other choice because their place of living and their ancestry has become uninhabitable. I leave it up to the reader to decide which way are we going to go. Are we going to head down the path that we certainly seem to be on right now, which is to destroy the planet as we know it, or are we going to work together? In bringing this thought experiment full circle, I emphasize that all producers of knowledge share the ethical responsibility to understand how this knowledge shapes society. By necessity, this must be a collective endeavor. When, if not now, should we make promises together and act in concert?
I certainly enjoyed reading your book, Writing Borderless Histories of Art, Human Exceptionalism, and the Climate Crisis, because you brought together so many disciplines and brought together so many historic facts that we aren't usually knowledgeable about and hear about, from science to art to anthropology to environmentalism. You tied them together and gave us the background of why we should be caring about what humans are doing to the planet, what humans have created, and how humans relate to the planet and the other life on Earth. It was a read that I hope others will find informative and will make them challenge their own thinking, because you definitely provided a lot of good detail to help us understand where we are and where we're going. Thank you so very much for giving us this information. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me as your guest and for so articulately summing up the main themes of my book. book. I couldn't have done it as well myself. Thank you.
You're welcome. I have been speaking with Claire Farago, who is Professor Emerita of Art History at the University of Colorado Boulder and is an affiliated faculty member at the University of California, Los Angeles Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, Early Global Studies Center. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.